we're sort of, if I could say, was ahead of its time, not to my benefit, however, because it talked about a better crowdfunding contract before crowdfunding had been invented. So it sort of got lost in the shuffle. But recently, two colleagues, Tim Kaysen and Robert Zabrikas, and I have performed some experiments, some lab experiments on the contract, and it does work. So that's been sort of gratifying to see after many years, not just theory. So I'll talk a little bit about that. And then the second paper I'm going to talk about is by Vitalik Buterin and Zoe Hitzig and Glenn Weil, which is the flexible design for funding public goods, recently published at Management Science, but has been around the blockchain world for some time. Okay, so let's begin with just a little bit of sort of review, and I'll be brief because I know this is review. Public goods. Public goods are a challenge to markets. Think about averting a flood, okay? Everyone would be better off if everyone contributed to averting the flood, but individual incentives mitigate against everyone contributing, right? So if everybody contributed, you'd be up here in this equilibrium, 900, 900. If no one contributes, you're down here. You know, so the better off equilibrium is certainly much better. But there's this, first of all, the famous free rider problem. And that is, if other people are contributing, then your incentives are not to contribute because other people are going to contribute to averting the flood. And if you do so, you don't get really an additional benefit. The flood is going to be averted no matter what you do. So you're going to want a free ride and not contribute. The other kind of problem is sort of less talked about, but it's right in there as well. And that's what I call the assurance problem. You're also worried that you might contribute and other people don't, and then your contribution is just wasted. You know, it's just down the drain, just wasted. So you have these kind of two problems. Now, let's see about how we can go about solving in steps some of these problems. Imagine that the town's mayor announces that those willing to build the dike are going to meet at town hall. And work will begin if and only if enough people gather so that the dike can be built high enough to avert the flood. Okay. So now you've actually eliminated the assurance problem. That is, you know, your contribution is never going to be wasted because you're only going to ever start if there's enough people there who have agreed already that we're going to avert the flood. So you're no longer, you've been given some assurance that your contribution won't be wasted. Now, of course, we still have over here the free rider problem, but maybe, you know, if people are altruistic or they want to be perceived as altruistic, then perhaps the free rider problem might be overcome. But we might be able to do even a little bit better. Suppose that the town's mayor announces that the dike will be built if and only if everyone agrees to contribute. Now you've actually eliminated the free rider problem because the dike is only going to be built if everyone contributes. Then if you don't contribute, there's no free riding because the public good won't be produced. So you can no longer free ride. Since everyone's contribution is required, there's no free riding. And actually, we've now eliminated the free rider problem. We've also eliminated the assurance problem. Well, you might think, okay, we're home free, but not quite. There's still actually no guarantee of success here because although contribute is an equilibrium, do not contribute remains an equilibrium. It's still also a Nash equilibrium. And you can see why by imagining that you believe that somebody else will not contribute. Okay, you believe that I will not contribute. Well, if you believe that I will not contribute, then it's perfectly rational for you not to contribute. And if you're not going to contribute, then it's perfectly rational for me not to contribute. So you can have kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? If I believe that you won't contribute, then it's rational for me not to contribute. And then your belief that I won't contribute is also rational. right? So you can have a rational kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. This, of course, would be even stronger if there was even just a, an epsilon cost of contributing. Then you could see how the do not contribute equilibrium could still be quite common. Now let's talk a little bit about crowdfunding. So crowdfunding, like Kickstarter, Indiegogo, and GoFundMe, they use the assurance contract method, which means that nobody pays until the total contributions exceed a threshold, which is high enough to ensure completion of the goal. And crowdfunding has been pretty successful. There's over 6 million crowdfunding campaigns last year, raised something like $35 billion. But there are some problems. There are some problems with crowdfunding. And most campaigns, in fact, fail. Okay, so Kickstarter success rate is only 37%. So most of the campaigns fail. Now, why is this? It could be, right, that they're just bad projects. That's definitely possible, right? But it could also be that we're in this do not contribute equilibrium, right? In the assurance contract game, there are multiple equilibria, and most of the equilibria involve a failure to coordinate on the most beneficial outcome. So it could be bad projects, but it could also be inefficient coordination. This is where the dominant assurance contract comes in, which is in my 1998 paper. You can also think about this as refund bonuses. So here's how it works. We have a crowdfunding entrepreneur, and they offer potential contributors a refund bonus. If they offer to contribute, but the contribution threshold is not reached, then the potential contributor gets their contribution back, just like at Kickstarter, plus a refund bonus. Okay. Now, the kind of amazing thing about this is that it actually now converts the public good game into a dominant, making it now a dominant strategy to contribute towards the public good. So we've gone from public goods being sort of impossible to fund to having a game where it's now a dominant strategy to contribute. Now, why is this? Well, imagine that you believe that other people are not contributing, okay? So if you think that other people will not contribute, well, then you want to contribute to get the bonus. On the other hand, if you think that other people will contribute, then you also want to contribute in order to get the public good produced, in order to push the public good over the threshold, which still benefits you. It still has a private benefit to you. So it's now a dominant strategy to contribute. And a kind of an interesting thing about this is that in equilibrium, the refund bonuses are never actually paid. This is a little bit like there's a famous Diamond and DeVivig model about bank deposit insurance. And the upshot of the model is that just knowing that there is deposit insurance means that there's no longer an incentive to run to the bank when you think that the bank might be running out of money, right? And if you don't run to the bank, then there is no bank collapse, right? So the nice feature about this deposit insurance is that it's an off the equilibrium path. And it means that since you never go there, you never actually have to pay the deposit insurance, right? And the same thing is true with these refund bonuses. In theory, that is in equilibrium, they're never actually paid. Now we'll see shortly, in practice, an entrepreneur who offers refund bonuses will still have to pay them some of the time. And perhaps one reason for that is although the only equilibria in this model have the public good being successfully funded, there are still multiple successful equilibria. When you don't require everyone, to contribute, there can still be multiple successful equilibria. And so there could still be some miscoordination on which of the successful equilibria you coordinate on. Anyway, we'll see that in practice shortly. Yeah, so the only Nash equilibrium in the game has the public good funded. But if not every player is necessary to reach the threshold, then it's no longer a dominant strategy to contribute. Still a Nash equilibrium. So this raises a bunch of questions about the structure of these refund bonuses. How should they be paid? Should it be a fixed amount like $10 or $20 or something like that? Or proportional to your contribution, 10%, 20%? When should they be paid? We might pay them, for example, only to early contributors. That's a possibility we're going to look at. And the reason we have some flexibility here, again, is because they're off the equilibrium path. So we actually have a little bit of design freedom. Great in theory. Okay. Does it work? Does it work in practice? So this is where we introduce a lab experiment. We have a crowdfunding platform, which is designed to mimic or replicate actual crowdfunding institutions. You can give contributions at any time, upward revisions, public updating of the aggregate contributions. There's always 2 campaigns that you can give to at any time in our lab. More details, you can look at the paper, but like there's 10 subjects per group. There's each run of the experiment is 2 minutes with a hard close. Each player knows the value of the public good to them, but that's private information. If the threshold is reached, each player gets the value of the public good to them. If the threshold is not reached, each player who agreed to contribute gets a refund bonus in the experiments with refund bonuses. We'll be running both. Okay. There's a bunch of different treatments here. I'm not going to go into details, but we have like a fixed treatment with a 3, a low, or a 6, a high. We have an early treatment. We have a proportional treatment. I'll say a little bit more, but here's the basic story. In the baseline treatment, only about 1/3 of projects are successfully funded. And this is in a lab situation in which, by design, all of the projects are socially valuable. There's no bad projects. All of the projects here are socially valuable, and yet only 1/3 are being successfully funded. So this kind of illustrates the large amount of equilibrium miscoordination. It's very close, by the way, to the Kickstarter number, right? I don't know, that maybe that's by accident, but happy accident in any case. Here's the basic story. Any refund bonus scheme increases the success rate by about 20 percentage points or 50%. There are some, sort of not too surprising differences, like if you give 6 instead of 3, you increase it even more. If you give 50 instead of 30, it's more, 20 instead of 10. So in each case, in each version, the larger refund bonus increases the success rate even more than the smaller refund bonus. But even the smaller refund bonuses increase the success rate really quite a bit. And you can also kind of see this in another way. In the baseline, nearly 20% of individuals just don't contribute at all, like they give 0, right? 20% of them. This halves or even quarters when refund bonuses are used. So this indicates you're really bringing more people in. You get more people on kind of the extensive and the intensive margin. These refund bonuses take people from not contributing anything towards contributing something, a lot of them. Now, one of the versions of the refund bonuses which we run was inspired by Benjamin Franklin. And Benjamin Franklin was known in his day as a successful crowdfunder. He was known as a guy who would get people together to, fund local roads and monuments and public parks and things like that. And he was asked, how do you do this? How do you successfully create so many of these public goods? And he said, in the first place, I advise you to apply to all those whom you know will give something. Next, to those whom you are uncertain whether they will give anything or not, and show them the list of those who have given. Okay, so Franklin was pointing to the importance of early contributions. Perhaps it's indicating, like, if Thomas Jefferson gave, then I want to give, right? If George Washington has given something to Benjamin Franklin's project, and probably that's a pretty good project, and I should give. I want to be with, I want to be with these guys, right? I want to be with Washington, right? And it may also just indicate this is a project which is going to be successful and which is useful, and people are, we're all in this together, okay? So he's signaling public spiritedness. You can also see this today. The outcome of a Kickstarter campaign can be predicted with 85% accuracy after only 15% of its duration. Right? Again, that could be because people recognize good or bad projects, but it also looks like if there's some sort of random reason why a Kickstarter campaign gets going early, then it tends to have momentum. It tends to have momentum, suggesting that there's something about this public spiritedness or signaling going on as well. Yeah, successfully funded projects tend to accumulate contributions from the start of the campaign. So can we use refund bonuses to kind of double our double the impact or increase the impact? They have some game theoretic impact, but maybe we can use them by structuring them. Maybe we can use them to also have this signaling or public spiritedness impact. So what we're going to do is compare two refund bonus schemes. P20, which is a proportional refund bonus of 20% paid on contributions made at any time during the contribution window. And we're going to compare that with PE20, which is a proportional refund bonus, 20% paid on contributions made during the first half of the contribution window. And when you do this, what you find, the baseline is 43.5% successful. P20, 60.5% successful. PE20, 67%. That's our most successful version of the refund bonus. The difference here is not quite statistically significant, but I think it's still, it's in the expected direction. And it has this other bonus benefit in that since you're only paying to the guys in the first half, you actually have to pay less. Okay, so you save on the amount of refund bonuses which you pay on the out of equilibrium when they fail. And I'll come back to that. Now let's look at a little bit more detail about why these refund bonuses work. And I think that will help to explain why the early refund bonus is particularly successful. I think the reason why the refund bonuses work is that they make more potential contributors pivotal sooner. What do I mean by pivotal? I mean, a contributor is pivotal when they would find it profitable, that is in their own self-interest, to push total contributions to the threshold or epsilon over the threshold. Okay, so a pivotal contributor is, at the very beginning, no one is pivotal because it's in the interest of no single individual to fund the public good. But as more and more people contribute, you get to a point where even for a single contributor, it's worthwhile for them in their private interest to push you over the equilibrium, over the threshold. And here's the time to first pivotal contributor. So in the baseline treatment, the first pivotal contributor, the mode, is really quite late, at 100 seconds in 120 seconds game, 2-minute kind of game, right? So you really get the most pivotal contributors really towards the end. P20, you get a bigger spike, but it's still at the end. Okay, it's still quite close. And there's clearly here an opportunity for sort of sniping or, inefficient equilibria where you fail to coordinate on you fail to coordinate on one of the multiple successful equilibria. That seems quite possible when people are just becoming pivotal towards the end. When you have the early treatment, okay, then you get people who are pivotal quite early in the first half. Not too surprising, right? They become pivotal right towards the end. And I think once you realize that you're pivotal, then there's a salience factor. You realize that it may sometimes be in your interest to fund this public good on your own to push it to the threshold. So the idea of becoming pivotal sooner, I think then you sort of learn to look out for being pivotal. Now, in theory, as I pointed out at the beginning, the refund bonuses are never paid. Right? In practice, we've seen that even in our very best model, a third of the time, the entrepreneur is going to have to pay up. We don't reach the threshold, and so the entrepreneur has to pay these refund bonuses out of his own pocket. So entrepreneurs, they have to balance greater campaign success using the refund bonuses with a greater risk of having to pay the refund bonuses and get nothing. Right? Now, of course, entrepreneurs have to take on all kinds of risks. This is just sort of, one among many risks, but we'd like to know, are these things profitable? And what we show in the paper is that with pretty modest markups, like 10 or 20%, that the refund bonuses are profitable. Okay, so the extra profit you make on the increase in the number of successful campaigns more than pays for the refund bonuses you have to pay for the unsuccessful campaigns. And here, as I mentioned earlier, the PE20 is especially profitable. That's the early payment because it increases the success rate. It works very well to increase the number of campaigns which are successful, but you also reduce the amount of refund bonuses typically that you're going to have to pay, since you only are paying to those who gave in the first half of the contribution period. Okay, so let me have a midway summary, and then we'll talk about the Vitalik paper. So midway summary: refund bonuses, they double crowdfunding campaign success. They pay for themselves. And all kinds of refund bonuses, the fixed, proportional, early, constant, they all work reasonably well. The early refund bonuses are especially powerful as they increase campaign success and cost less. Okay. Now, let's make a distinction now between the contribution problem of public goods and the information revelation problem. So what I've been talking about so far, the refund bonus scheme, this works well when you know the public good that you want to produce. And the problem is gathering enough contributors. So if you're building a lighthouse, a public monument, or a dam, you know from technological considerations, like how big the dam should be, right? A half a dam ain't gonna cut it. 3/4 of a dam is no good. Right? Going in, the dam has got to be of certain size. And your problem is then just figuring out, how are we going to get people to contribute to the dam? But there's a second public good problem, and that is maybe you don't know how much people value the public good. Like, how much should you spend on public parks versus fireworks shows? And this is where information revelation mechanisms, such as the quadratic funding mechanism of Buterin, Hitzig, and Weil, can help to reveal information about which public goods to provide. The defect, as we'll see, is that this Buterin, Hitzig, Weil mechanism, it's great for revealing this information, but it comes at a price. you're going to have to subsidize the contributions. You're going to have to require some government or outside funding. So the refund bonuses get people to contribute. This information revelation mechanism is going to reveal information, but you got to pay for that information. So let's see how this works. And again, let's briefly review the public good optimum when we're talking about a continuous public good. So here we don't know how much of the public good we want. It's not like a dam, but we have some choices, and G will be the amount of the public good. Okay, we want to figure out how much G do we want. Okay? And we have two individuals. This is the marginal benefit of G to individual 2, this gold line. The blue line is the marginal benefit of the public good to individual 1. And the red line here is the marginal cost. Now notice that on their own, neither individual is willing to pay for even the very first unit of the public good, okay? Because their marginal benefit for even the most valuable unit is less than the marginal cost, okay? For each of these individuals, the highest marginal benefit they get from the public good, it's less than the marginal cost. But since it's a public good, we find the optimum by summing up these marginal benefit curves, okay? The public good is going to benefit both individuals, so we sum them up, and we get the green curve, which is the sum of the marginal benefit curves. And setting the sum of the marginal benefits equal to the marginal cost tells us that the optimum amount of the public good is here at 10, okay? Yeah. The question then becomes, well, how does the government know how much of this public good to produce, right? Individuals are not willing to pay for it. How are they going to know these marginal benefit curves, right? We have an information revelation problem. The government doesn't know the value of the public good to the individuals, and so doesn't know the sum of the marginal benefits and what the optimum should be. The quadratic funding mechanism is a kind of a remarkable information revelation mechanism. And what the authors show is that if the funders agree to subsidize contributions to the public good, according to the quadratic funding formula, then individuals will agree to contribute such that the optimum is reached. So, in other words, given this formula, which I'm going to show you in a minute, the optimum is going to be revealed by individual choices. Okay, the optimum is revealed by individual choices. So what's the funding formula? The quadratic funding formula is the sum of the square root of the contributions all squared. Okay, pretty simple to write out. So here it is, where CI is I's contribution to the public good. When individuals know that the total funding of the public good will be G, will be given by this formula, then individuals will contribute such that G is equal to G star, where G star is the optimum level. So the Nash equilibrium has the optimum public good being chosen. Kind of surprising, because it's not that complicated, but it's surprising. So I'm going to give you an example. I'm not going to prove this. It's not too hard to prove, but I'm just going to give you a simple example. Suppose we go back to our two-person example, okay? And now we tell them G is equal to the square root of C1 plus the square root of C2, all squared. Then it is in individual 1 and 2's self-interest to choose C1 and C2 such that C1 turns out to be 45 over 8 and C2 is equal to 5 over 8. You put this into the formula, bang, you get 10. G star is equal to 10. And these are the individually rational, self-interested contribution amounts, okay? Notice, however, that there's a subsidy because the sum of 45 over 8 and 5 over 8 does not equal 10. So the government or somebody else has got to come up with 3.75 to subsidize this. Let's take a closer look at this subsidy. So here's G once again. The subsidy is then G minus the sum of the individual contributions. And I'm going to show you this using a kind of clever diagram, which is due to Vitalik Buterin. So we're going to put the square root of the contributions along the horizontal axis and sum them all up. So there's 4 of them. And let's do the same thing along the vertical axis. So now we're going to square the sum, and that gives you G. So this yellow area is G, the funding for the public good. Now, what are the contributions? Well, the contributions, you see, are just the square roots squared is the contributions. So the contributions here are C1, C2, C3, C4. And then you can see that the subsidy is the remaining area, the yellow area minus the green area. Okay, so that's how much you're going to have to, someone is going to have to subsidize. Okay. Now, let's take a, how do these subsidies work? Okay. The total subsidies will increase as each individual contribution becomes small relative to the whole. So imagine that instead of this set of individuals, we had a different set like this. And now you can see that the subsidies are getting bigger. If you get really small, then the subsidies are huge. Okay. And this makes sense because it reflects the logic that in the atomistic world, fewer externalities are internalized. So you need bigger subsidies. Okay. When you have a public good such as each individual just has a small benefit, but their contribution benefits many, many other people, all of whom are externalities, okay, then most of the contribution, most of the value of the contribution comes in the externality, which the individual doesn't care about. So you need a big subsidy. Corollary of this, if you have one contributor, well, then there should be no externality, right? And then there should be no subsidy. And in fact, the formula tells you that. Okay, good. It works out the way we'd like, right? So if there's only one contributor, then when you square the square root, you get just back their contribution amount. So kind of another way of saying how this mechanism works is that quadratic funding penalizes the oligarchs and benefits the people, right? So if there's only a few oligarchs who are giving to the public good, then there's not much of a subsidy. If instead you have a public good where there's lots of people who want to give a small amount, then there's a big subsidy, okay? Now, in the sort of literature, in the popular literature, this is often expressed in this kind of language, right? You know, penalizing the oligarchs and benefiting the people. But the logic is actually the externality logic. This is a consequence of that externality logic, but the mechanism wasn't actually produced in order to have these consequences. It's just that you could express the logic of the externality consequence in terms of this sort of politicized language, which has made it perhaps a little bit easier to sell. And let's just say a little bit more about this because it's kind of interesting. Essentially, what the subsidies do is they internalize the externality, or they make up for the externality. Imagine you just had these guys 1 and 2 the way that we were looking at before. So when one gives some contribution, right, that gives a benefit to the second individual. And when the second individual gives their contribution, that provides a benefit to the first individual. If these guys cared for one another, if C1 and C2 were to marry, okay, and to act as a unified individual, then you wouldn't need any subsidy at all because they would internalize their own externalities. It's what the subsidy does is it's what is needed to make the total contribution as if 1 and 2 cared for one another. Okay, so you're making up for the lack of altruism. You are internalizing you're creating a subsidy which makes it as if 1 and 2 had internalized the externality. Okay. Now, a number of you have probably noticed already that there is a problem, right? There is a problem. Altruism is great and all and so forth, but there's a problem here. And that is a Sybil attacks, or one of the problems anyway. So imagine again, we have these two individuals. So individual 1 contributes 4, individual 2 contributes 4, total contribution is 8. You put this into the quadratic funding formula, you get that the total funding of the public good is 16. 16 minus 8 is 8, so you get a subsidy of 8. Okay. Now, imagine instead that C1 Sybils and submits 1111, and C2 continues to submit 4. Then the total contributions remain the same, 8. But now when you put this into the formula, you get 36 for the funding for the public good. And so the subsidy has increased dramatically. Okay. So Sybiling increases the subsidy dramatically. Clear incentive to Sybil here. And that gets even worse if the donor is also the recipient. So, you know, a Sybil attack plus kind of self-dealing is really going to create very large incentives to grab up, to take advantage of the mechanism by grabbing up the subsidy. There's another, so we're going to need some identity proof. We're going to need some identity proof if we want to kind of make this practical. And I'll come back and talk about that in practice in a few minutes. There's another kind of problem or issue which we're not totally sure about, and that is the Nash equilibrium of the quadratic funding mechanism is at the optimum level of the public good funding. We can show that in theory, but it isn't a dominant strategy. So that means that the optimal contribution for 1 depends upon how much 2 is giving and vice versa. So you really need to kind of grope towards equilibrium. And Gitcoin, we're going to talk about it in a minute, you know, have this kind of nice little visualization of how much when you contribute, how much that's changing the subsidy, and, you know, and how much when other people change their contributions, how much that is going to change and so forth. But there really is, there really has to be this groping towards equilibrium. And as far as I know, the quadratic funding formula hasn't been tested in the lab, something I'd like to do to see how close we get to Nash equilibrium. Right? We hope we get close, but we're not actually sure about that. Now let's look at this in practice. Because Gitcoin, to their credit, this is very interesting, has made donations to Ethereum projects using the quadratic funding mechanism. So it's really rarely in the history of mechanisms have we seen a mechanism being described in theory and then being adopted in practice so quickly. So in their latest round, Gitcoin, they donated 1.38 million in total to 812 different Ethereum projects. They got 880,000 from over 12,000 contributors, a lot of small contributors, and they subsidized it up to 500K, so 500,000 in subsidies. Sybil attacks have been pretty common, and they become more common over time as people have learned about this mechanism. So some projects, they promise people who donated to their project on Gitcoin that they would get rewarded later, right? So there's an element of self-dealing there. And this can be pretty profitable, right? Because a small donation could result in a relatively large reward due to the subsidy. So it's possible to squeeze the subsidy giver to give back more to people who contribute to your project than they gave, and to maintain a nice little pot for yourself. What have they been doing about this? They've been using a combination of machine and human intelligence to kind of thwart Sybil attacks and self-dealing. And what they're doing is they're moving towards identity verification using GitHub accounts. And this is pretty clever, making donations impossible to prove. So this is where the donee doesn't know who gave the money, and the donor can't prove that they donated. So, there's no honor among thieves, and there's no honor among Sybil Attack, rent seekers who are subsidy seekers, right? So somebody who is willing to subsidy attack is probably also willing to claim that they subsidy attacked in order to get the benefit that you promised them. And knowing this reduces the benefit of creating this kind of scheme to begin with, right? Because people are just going to lie and say that they attacked, and when they actually didn't, right? So this is kind of a clever idea. More generally, I think what this illustrates is what I call the fundamental problem of collusion, just something Vitalik has been talking about recently. And that's this: mechanisms that allow unorganized groups to coordinate, which is desirable, are vulnerable to organized groups that collude. So when you give people tools to coordinate, those tools almost inevitably can also be used to collude. And that's really this fundamental problem of collusion, which I think is, well, I think it's fundamental. Okay, so let's summarize. Refund bonuses improve the crowdfunding contract and can solve the contribution problem. The quadratic funding mechanism can elicit people's preferences for public goods using subsidy. What's the big picture here? The big picture, I think, I go back to Hayek. And Hayek talked about competition as a discovery procedure. And we use it to discover what people want and the best ways of producing goods. But for public goods, because of the free rider and the assurance contract problem and so forth, we haven't been able to use competition to discover the most demanded public goods produced in the least costly ways. We haven't been able to use the market, the competition. Crowdfunding with refund bonuses and the quadratic funding mechanism, they're two mechanisms that can actually bring competition to the provision of public goods. So more generally, creating mechanisms that allow entrepreneurs and markets to produce public goods, right? That sounds like a contradiction. 30 years ago, 20 years ago, that would have been a contradiction, like allowing entrepreneurs and markets to produce public goods. That's something which doesn't make sense in traditional theory, but we've just seen that it is at least possible to some extent. Allowing entrepreneurs and markets to produce public goods may create more and better public goods, because for the first time, we'll be able to use all of the benefits of competition as a discovery procedure to figure out what people actually want and what is the best way of producing what they actually want. Thank you very much. Thank you, Tim.
Thank you, Alex. I'll clap on behalf of the audience.
Appreciate it.
So as promised, there's plenty of time for Q&A. So there's one question there, which either Alex, you can read, or I can read it to you.
Right.
And other audience members should definitely are encouraged to, either in the chat or in the Q&A, to type in questions.
So let me take the first question, which is from Philip. What are your thoughts on refund bonuses if they're used by default? Do you think the overall funding rate increases, or do you think they only increase relative compared to the projects without using refund bonuses? Yeah. So there's a very interesting question, which is what happens if you give entrepreneurs the option to use a refund bonus? And you can imagine that there's some signaling benefits there, right? Because an entrepreneur who offers a refund bonus is sort of like a warranty in a sense that signals that they're pretty confident that they're not going to have to pay the refund bonus, right? Like, why do you buy a product with a guarantee? Is it because you expect to use the guarantee? No, you buy the product with a guarantee because you expect that means you won't have to use the guarantee. Now, the tricky part, however, is what I said can't be completely true, because if every entrepreneur with a good project uses refund bonuses and people realize, oh, that signals that's a good project, well, now you've created an incentive for someone with a bad project, right, to offer the refund bonus, even though it's not a good project. So there's a complicated signaling game in which you expect some sort of randomization. Most good projects offering refund bonuses and most bad projects don't, but there still be some kind of mixed equilibrium in which some bad projects also offer refund bonuses. Right? So I think that's going to be, that's something which my co-authors and I are looking into. What happens when you allow refund bonuses as a signal? Overall, I think refund bonuses or these types of schemes, I think they expand the amount of public goods which can be produced. Okay. Most crowdfunding campaigns, as we saw, fail. That indicates, I think, that there's actually a room for a lot more of them. And so I think we could increase the number of successful public goods being produced in these market-like settings. So I think ideally, this is what I was talking about at the end of the talk, is competition as a discovery procedure, that if we use more of these types of mechanisms, we might see a flowering of public good provision to do things which we never realized were public goods.
All right, well, maybe I'll go next. So I really like how the arc of the talk, you sort of start from some very basic economic principles, the free rider problem, the assurance problem, and so on. Then you wound up talking about sort of how Gitcoin funding actually works, which is sort of very cool. But I wonder if we could, maybe talk more about potential applications in the blockchain space of some of the things you talked about. And it could either be directly some of the solutions you've brought out here, or just, as you were going through that first part of the talk, I was thinking of issues that come up, say, in the design of algorithmic stable coins, right? Where sort of like, beliefs about others' value, of a stable coin is sort of, tends to govern to what extent it stays stable for some period of time. Or I just think of the basic kind of like tokenomics questions that lots of protocols are focused on, like how do you incentivize early adoption through an appropriate, kind of token distribution and sort of evolving rewards. So just, and if you prefer more broadly, just, what do you think other economists really should be working on in the blockchain space?
Yeah. Okay, so two things. So on the Gitcoin kind of stuff and the quadratic funding mechanism, I think it's a little bit ironic in that the quadratic funding mechanism, which was created by Vitalik and his co-authors Glenn Weil and Hitzig, in some ways that is not at all suited to the blockchain, precisely because of these Sybil attacks. Though it's something, of course, which Vitalik is thinking about, these public goods, and this problem of governance is a big one in the blockchain space, right? So even with something like Bitcoin, and I guess I'm going to be, controversial here among some communities or something like that, it really cannot just be given from the mind of Satoshi once and forevermore, the code just lives on. We've seen that, there are, even putting aside potential for bugs and things like that, there are lots of ways in which the community might want to evolve. And you could evolve slowly, Bitcoin, or you could evolve more quickly, Ethereum, but you need some kind of process for evolving. So I think there's a big scope for governance. And exactly how are you going to do that? Refund bonuses, these kinds of games is one possibility for governance. I think we need a lot of experiments. There's a lot of things we can do with cryptography that we have not been able to do before. So the whole theory of democracy I think can be revisited. You know, democracy and voting theory really began in the 19th century. Borda and Condorcet and all of those guys. And cryptography just opens up that space. And I think it could be revisited. On stable coins. I would love to see some application. I don't have that one off the top of my head, Tim. So, you know, I'm really hoping that when I give a talk like this, somebody who's much smarter than I will take up some of these ideas and use them in ways which I could never have predicted. So that's kind of my goal there. Let me look at this other question, which has come in on the chat. Yeah, could you expand a bit more on how the externalities between Gitcoin participants are accounted for? Does the quadratic rule allow you to account for things like congestion as well? Okay, yeah. It's a bit interesting how many of the externalities like you should account for and how much is sort of normal. So for example, if my wife and I both contribute to a public good, should our contribution be counted as one, or should it be counted as two? You know, if we give individually, but we take into account that my contribution will also benefit my wife and my wife's contribution will also benefit me, is that something that you want to call a Sybil attack? Or is that just, you know, normal, right? So I think the dividing line, and this is what Gitcoin is grappling with, the dividing line between what is collusion, what is self-dealing, what is unfair, unjust, and what actually is fine and something you want to support, that dividing line is much fuzzier than people imagine. And this goes back to what I was saying about governance. Algorithmically, I think it's going to be very, very difficult to make that dividing line. And this is the whole point of law, right? This whole point of having judges, that you need kind of some human being there to make some kind of judgment. And it's very difficult to get away from that, especially when you have all these big incentives around, right? So you have a lot of incentives to game the system, and to try and counter those incentives to game the system with an algorithm, I will give it to the human beings every time, right? So it's very, very difficult to find an algorithm which is going to beat human beings who are highly incentivized. I mean, that is our goal. That's our goal, but that I think is very difficult, especially when, as in the case of these externalities, we're not actually totally sure in our own minds and in our own hearts what should count as self-dealing and what should count as just and unjust or not. So I don't have an answer for you other than to say this is exactly what Gitcoin is grappling with, and Vitalik has a couple of posts on this, and they haven't solved the problem. This is really a live question.
So it's safe to say you're fairly skeptical of purely on-chain governance, kind of in a broad sense?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly right, Tim.
Interesting.
I mean, I would love that, right? If that, you know, could, and maybe in some very restricted circumstances, you know, that could work. But we've got, you know, several thousands of years of dealing with governance issues. And I think it would be very difficult, like, to throw out the wisdom of the common law is basically what people are trying to do. They're trying to replace the common law with some algorithmic rules. And I just think, you know, we're not there yet. We're not there yet. I mean, I would love it if we could do that, but I think we got quite a ways to go.
Now, actually, I wonder if you can even sort of phrase it as part of the issues in the blockchain world is just think of it as a stackable game, right? Where the algorithm has to go first. Like you have to define the decision-making procedure. And that, so when you said you'll always take the humans, my reaction was, well, the humans get to go second. So that's one of the reasons I tend to side with the humans. Whereas law, you get more iterations, right? Someone writes the law, people behave, but then the law is interpreted post-behavior. So maybe that gives you sort of a little more flexibility in the decision-making process.
Right, exactly. And one of the things Gitcoin has done, which illustrates what you're saying perfectly, is they don't tell you the algorithms that they're using, right? Precisely for this reason, because they know that it would be much easier to game. So in that sense, they are trying to make the algorithm more judge-like in that you don't actually know what it's going to do given your set of behaviors.
Right. Okay, well, I think we're out of time. It's 1:15. So Alex, thanks again for the fascinating talk and Q&A. It's great having you.